Alright guys, what's up? So with Empires of the Ascended out, there are a ton of new interesting interactions in the game, some of which are actually really counterintuitive, and I promise even if you are very familiar with all the different interactions in the game, there will be at least something in this video that you weren't aware of. So here are 11 new interactions or tricks using the new cards. Some of these are just going to be straight up tips, while others are going to be very obscure interactions, and some are going to be pretty obvious interactions that I'm sure most of you guys know. So interaction number one, this is kind of a broad category because we're going to be talking about Concurrent Timelines, baby. Concurrent Timelines is a crazy card with a ton of wild implications, so this is more of a category than anything else. So Concurrent Timelines is a transform effect. You are transforming into a different follower. But did you know that there's two types of transformations in Legends of Runeterra? Concurrent Timelines is what we call a self-transform, which is also part of what, Gallant Rider, for example, is another self-transform. It transforms itself. This is very different from cards that transform other units like Mystifying Magician. This will transform another ally and it will become a random 5-cost follower. What's the difference? Well, there's one big difference, which is that other transforms, a card that transforms a different card, will not keep any of the modifiers of the initial transform target. This will transform into a vanilla copy of a random 5-cost follower, whereas self-transforms like Concurrent Timelines and Gallant Rider, these cards will maintain all modifications that were given to them. So if, for example, if you hand buff something that you transform off of Concurrent Timelines, the transformed card will maintain that buff. The new card that it transforms to still has all the same modifications, all of them. Now, while this is kind of counterintuitive at first, I asked the devs about this and they said that their reasoning behind it was because cards that transformed themselves, they wanted to make it intuitive with how champions work, champion level up, right? And when a champion levels up, it's kind of like a transform effect, but not only are you gaining the new effect and the new stats, but you're keeping your old modifications. So that's why it's in the game like that. So what are the implications this has for Concurrent Timelines? Well, actually quite a lot. There are a lot of crazy things you can do with it because your unit keeps all the keywords and the modifiers that it initially had. So as a random example, this is a toy example, I would not recommend this, but if you were to play Basilisk Rider with Concurrent Timelines in a Noxus Allegiance deck, your Basilisk Rider would transform into a unit that maintained the +1/+1 buff and Overwhelm. The, of course, hilarious thing you could do is Ancient Crocolith. This would be an 8/8 Overwhelm if you transformed into it off of Basilisk Rider. This also means Concurrent Timelines is able to maintain effects such as the Scrapped Porobot. You are keeping the keyword off of this. You're keeping Mist Wraiths, which is very interesting. You will keep all the +1s that your Mist Wraiths have accumulated if you're transforming Mist Wraiths, and basically any sort of hand buff effect. So there are a lot of things you can actually do with this in Concurrent Timelines decks. My personal favorite full meme combo with Concurrent Timelines is using it on Unstable Voltician. Keep in mind, it will keep these modifiers because Unstable Voltician gives it modifiers on play. So you will transform into a random 5-cost unit that is +4 attack and quick attack as long as you've cast a 6+ cost spell prior to playing Unstable Voltician. So what this means is, in the best case scenario, you can transform into Ruin Runner and have a 5-mana 10/4 quick attack overwhelm spell shield if it happens exactly like that, which is just a really, really funny thing to play on turn 5. And speaking of spell shield, tip number 2 is that the new card Blighted Ravine fully goes through spell shield. This is a slightly counterintuitive at first. It is a damage effect, but because spell shield only blocks things that are spell shield, only blocks things that are, spells or skills. It does not have anything to do with damage from a landmark, which means Blighted Ravine will go right through it. This is pretty important. Blighted Ravine is a very, very popular card. This is one of the strongest of the new cards and has a lot of implications in terms of being able to damage through anything else. Another quirk with Blighted Ravine is that the units and landmarks you have on your board that trigger at the start of the round, like Blighted Ravine, resolve left to right. What this means is if you take, let's say something like an Ember Maiden and a Blighted Ravine Ravine on the board on the same time. If your Blighted Ravine is on the left of Ember Maiden, then it will trigger first, killing the Ember Maiden, which sometimes stops the Ember Maiden from going off entirely, which can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on your board state. But if your Ember Maiden is on the right side of, or sorry, if your Ember Maiden is on the left side of Blighted Ravine, it goes, the Ember Maiden goes first, and then the Blighted Ravine goes second, which means the Ember Maiden will go no matter what. One really interesting thing about this quirk of unit and landmark positioning is that you can actually rearrange the units on your board just by dragging them to the center and pulling them back. Even if you aren't declaring an attack, if you have the attack token, you can rearrange your left to right just by dragging and moving them. This actually does matter sometimes in some Blighted Ravine decks that run additional tools like Ember Maiden. All right, tip number 3. So this is just a straight up tip, not an interaction really at all, but Rockhopper is a really great card that I think people are using wrong and also undervaluing. Rockhopper is one of my favorite designed cards in the entire game. He leads to super cool interactions and gameplay that I think a lot of people are overlooking. Rockhopper is a card that a lot of people play just kind of instinctively on turn 2. You know, it's a 2-mana unit, you want to play it on 2, but in a lot of cases in Legends of Runeterra, you're actually okay banking spell mana, and if you time your Rockhopper very precisely with an opponent's power tool that they don't want to give vulnerable to, you can actually make their plays reliably. This can happen almost every game. You make their plays super awkward and can sometimes lock them out of an entire turn. Now, this is pretty tricky to do and will require you to know your opponent's deck pretty well, understand what their kind of like scary bomb turn is in early development, and plan around and plan ahead around locking them out of something. Here's an example. In a Fiora Shen deck, for they usually want to be playing Fiora or River Shaper on turn 3, right? And they don't usually want to give it vulnerable in that deck, depending on your options for being able to attack into it. So if your opponent is attacking on turn 3, that means they'll play Fiora or River Shaper on turn 3, and that means on your turn 2, well, you can try to Rockhopper to lock them out of it. But you only want to be doing that if your opponent doesn't play something on turn 2, right? So it's pretty complicated and you have to plan it out quite ahead, but you get an insane reward if you're able to drop your Rockhopper on like right before an opponent power play, right? So if they're attacking on the turn that they want to play their card, then they're going to go first in that turn, which means you need to play Rockhopper at the end of the previous turn. If you're attacking on the turn where they're playing their card, then you can just play Rockhopper first into that action. So for example, if you're playing against TF Fizz and you're attacking on evens, you're going to go first on turn 4, which means you can cleanly play Rockhopper on turn 4 first and make it a little bit awkward for them. A lot of boards actually can't afford to just like play TF into giving him vulnerable, and that's incredibly powerful, right? So just think about what your opponent's like kind of power move. Usually this is on turn 3 or 4, but in a lot of decks it can be later, and just think, okay, my opponent's playing Kindred on 5, man, I can make this Kindred vulnerable and lock them out. So there's so much counterplay and so much thinking ahead with this card. I think people are really undervaluing him. Super well designed card. All right, tip number 4. Predict is really powerful. Now, I think at least a good amount of people know this by now because I've mentioned this like every time I make a guide and every day I'm on my stream. But I still know that there's still some people that don't know this, which is that there's a giant blue skip button on the predict. It's a big blue skip button. This means if you press it, you won't see any of the 3 things you choose, and you'll be able to get a random card instead, which is incredibly powerful because there's a lot of cases where you'll see 3 things you don't want, and the ability to decline that is great. Another really cool tip you can do with predict, though, just in case you already knew that, is you can use predict with Stalking Shadows. This is a really great combo because being able to clone what's at the top of your deck reliably is super powerful, and Shurima Shurima and Shadow Isles already want to be run together, so it's an amazing combo. A lot of people like the idea of using Predict with the Allegiance cards, which is kind of like a similar idea. You're like predicting and making sure the Allegiance is hitting every time. Unfortunately, this doesn't really end up working very well at all. I mean, the Shurima Allegiance card, Golden Ambassador, this might be useful for this when Mono Shurima is more of a thing, but none of the other Allegiance cards want to be ran with Shurima as the splash. And also, usually the Allegiance cards, fun fact, they all have 4 mana, and usually these cards want to be played on curve, right? You don't really want to wait until like turn 5 or 6 so you can predict and then play the Allegiance card. So I would say that one is a bit of a dud. All right, tip number 5. I think this one is very, very well known at this point, but Cataclysm, when used on a scout unit, will give you a free rally. I will mention it in this video, even though a lot of people know about it, just because if you haven't seen this happen or you haven't heard someone explain this, it is very counterintuitive, and like, you know, most people don't realize that it happens without seeing it somewhere, but the whole point of Cataclysm is to be able to use it on a scout for the free rally. This is kind of weird, but because scout units read the first time only scout units attack each round, ready your attack. So if you haven't attacked yet with scout units for a round, like if you're on a defensive round and you use Cataclysm on a scout unit, it will start the free attack from Cataclysm and you will get a free rally. After that resolves, you will get a free normal full attack for the round. Because again, scouts ready your attack when they attack. All right, tip number 6. So a lot of you guys do know about the Concurrent Timelines Dreadway Ledros interaction, of course. This is pretty much the most standard way of using Concurrent Timelines right now. You play Ledros on turn 9 and roll the 60% chance to transform it into Dreadway, which will immediately kill your opponent's Nexus. The only thing is that there's actually one situation in the game where it won't kill your opponent's Nexus, and that is Lissandra giving their Nexus tough. This matters quite a bit because, of course, Lissandra is a pretty common deck right now, and a lot of people, you know, who happen to be running Dreadway Ledros right now will definitely be meeting Lissandra decks. The trick of it is, sometimes you actually need your opponent to have more Nexus HP to be able to kill them through their tough Nexus. Here's why. So Ledros will always try to deal exactly half of the enemy Nexus, but it'll round the damage up. So if your opponent is playing tough Lissandra and their Nexus is tough with 16 Nexus health, your Ledros will try to deal 8, of course half of 16. Your Dreadway will double that, 8 to 16, and you won't win the game because your opponent's 16 health tough Nexus will survive at 1 health. But if the opponent's Nexus is at 17 health, well, your Ledros will round up the half on that damage, trying to deal 9 damage instead of 8. Then the Dreadway will double the 9, right? Because Dreadway just doubles the damage. It doesn't care that your Ledros has already rounded up, and that will effectively deal 18 damage. That's what will, you know, get on the stack with Ledros' ability. And in that case, even though their Nexus has 17 health and tough, it will die to 18 damage. What this means is in this matchup, you actually need to make sure throughout the game to try to set the opponent's Nexus to an odd amount of HP rather than an even one. It literally doesn't matter how much HP it is, it just needs to be an odd amount so that they die through Lissandra's tough. All right, tip number, I've lost count at this point. You can use Siphoning Strike on your own allies for some reason. I have no idea. It's practically inexplicable why you're able to strike your own unit. None of the other strike cards let you do that. For example, Concerted Strike, you have to strike an enemy, but for some reason, Siphoning Strike can be used on your own units. Nobody knows why. And there's not really a good way to use this, but something that like we have thought about a while ago and have built one deck around using is the idea of running Lucian and Senna. Lucian's already here with Senna, and then making the Siphoning Strike, allowing the Lucian to strike the Senna. This will of course level the Lucian because your Senna will die, and it'll grant itself +2/+2 at the same time. It's a really dumb concept, but honestly, there's just no other way to use the fact that Siphoning Strike can hit your own unit. Alright, interaction number 8. Kindred has a kind of like sort of hidden ability where their ability to mark a unit for slay actually resets on level up. A lot of Kindred players are already familiar with this, but it's actually a really cool interaction for anyone who wants to play Kindred a decent amount. They will need to be aware of this. And even if you're seeing an enemy Kindred, knowledge of this is actually really important and will save you sometimes. Basically, the ability to every round mark a unit completely resets on level up. So if the Kindred is 1 out of 2, if then a unit gets slain and the mark happens, and then the marked unit gets slain and Kindred levels up, well, if we're still on the same turn, even on this same turn, if another unit gets slain, the Kindred level 2, it will effectively be a new unit and it will mark again that round. This is actually fairly common. I mean, it's not like, you know, you're not going to see this every game, but for like these sorts of niche interactions this will happen a decent amount. So if you play Kindred, you will need to be aware of this for sure. But even if you're seeing a decent amount of Kindred from your opponents, you need to make sure if Kindred levels up, they can mark again. Tip number 9, I'm pretty sure. So one thing in Empires of the Ascended that got pushed a lot harder than before was there's a lot of, especially the new champions, that end up making the attack order matter quite a bit. And I see a lot of people kind of like misplaying around the attack order. So many of these new champions actually have a really large impact on that. So for anyone who hasn't played Runeterra a ton, well, attacks resolved left to right. So when you declare an attack, sometimes you want to drag some units to the left and some units to the right. For example, LeBlanc usually wants to be dragged to the right because her level up is I've seen you deal 15 plus damage, so the more things that have happened before that, if you drag other attackers to the left, she has a good chance to level during that combat step as long as she's towards the end of the attack. That's a pretty easy example, and there's a lot of things that actually get a little trickier. For example, Sivir is a little bit weirder. Sivir levels up when you've dealt 35 plus damage, which means if your Sivir hasn't leveled up yet and you're thinking about taking an attack including a Sivir, well, she should likely be somewhere closer to the right side of that combat so that she can level before it's her turn. But also because when she's attacking allied attackers have her keywords, well, if she's already leveled, you want to make sure that she's not dying for the attack, right? Which means she wants to be on the extreme right side, right? Because that's how you're able to keep her alive throughout an attack. If she dies to combat from something like a barrier, well, other allies will have the keywords for that combat before she dies. So leveled Sivir wants to be on the far right. But there's a lot of cases where, and you have to kind of do the math in the moment, you might want the Sivir to be attacking more like in the middle if she hasn't leveled up yet, because you might need that exact amount of damage from that combat to be able to level her up on one combat action before your last thing goes, and you want that last thing to get quick attack so that, you know, it can survive its own attack from Sivir's level up. So it's something to kind of be aware of, and depending on the situation, you will have to position her differently. Nasus has a similar thing going on. Nasus gains stats for every unit you've slain this game, so naturally, in a lot of cases, you might want to have him closer to the right side of a combat if he actually needs those stats to perform, because you will be slaying things before it's his turn. But once he strikes for 10, he levels up, which makes all enemies have -1 attack. So if he's striking for 10, you might want him to the left of a unit that's getting blocked for an even combat, because then he'll level before that combat happens, giving the minus attack. And then the last thing is Kindred. Kindred is also a little bit weird as well, because while there's a Kindred on the board, the weakest thing that dies will get the first mark. So Kindred is probably the trickiest of all to be able to, you know, fully map an attack sequence with, because you need to make sure that if the opponent blocks with something that's a little bit weaker, you want their weaker blocker to be on the left side so that the mark goes on something else apart from the unit that's already dying to combat, right? So imagine a board state where your opponent has a 0-1, a prey or something that they're blocking with. If they can choose to block with it or not, you want the unit to try to block on the left side so that if there is another unit on the bench or something that has the ability to, that you might want to kill that might not want to block, well, then you can mark it by forcing their blocker on the left side instead of just allowing them to block something else on the left side and then block with their prey later on, right? So that's a little bit tricky, and there will just be a lot of cases where you'll have to think about attack order a lot more in Empires of the Ascended than previous expansions. Tip number 10, this is actually this isn't really an interaction. Tip number 10 is that Three Sisters is a good card. I'd recommend running this good card. I think there's a decent amount of the Trundle Lysandra decks that are not actually running enough Three Sisters. This card's flexibility in that deck is actually just incredibly valuable, mostly because the ability to entomb things for 6 mana in the late game is actually really great. There will be a lot of cases where you will be able to stop tools such as, Lee Sin's Dragon Kick or Atrocity you can stop with the Flash Freeze. The flexibility of this card, Three Sisters, makes it in many ways better than Vengeance, to the point where a lot of these, Freljord decks are actually cutting out Shadow Isles as a region because Three Sisters is able to somewhat replace Vengeance, which is kind of incredibly powerful. But there's so many cases where Entomb will do just what you ended up wanting from anything else that you don't need more than just Three Sisters. And tip number 11, the final tip. This is absurdly specific. This is a niche interaction, but it's also really, really funny. So when Azir levels up to level 3, you replace your deck with the Emperor's deck. The Emperor's deck is a very special deck with extremely powerful tools that you can only get from the Emperor's deck. But it also spawns with the same tools every time. The Emperor's deck will always have 15 cards, and it's made up of 4 of the Emperor's Guard, 2 of Emperor's Prosperity, 1 Shimmering Mirage, 1 Crumbling Sands, 2 Golden Herald, 1 General's Palace, 2 Eternal Gladiator, 1 Sandstorm, and 1 Ascended's Call. Now, the one quirk of this is that Ascended's Call, the 10 mana Rally, Summon, Renekton, and Nasus that get to level 3, this will always be at the exact bottom of the deck, no matter what. When the Emperor's deck is generated, Ascended's Call will always spawn on the bottom of the deck. Now, what this means is that, let's say if Mono Shurima was ever, a little bit more picks. And one thing I will say, Mono Shurima is not great right now. I would not recommend it competitively. But as more cards get added, it will be a lot better, right? Like, as we have Shurima during the full region, like in the third part of the expansion, we'll actually see a decent amount of Mono Shurima, and I expect it to be at least decent, really. But the trick is, you can nab the card. Now, nab reads, draw a non-champion card from the bottom of the enemy deck. And if we actually see more Mono Shurima, there will be, of course, a lot more nab options because, we can use Black Market Merchant or Pilfered Goods. But when they get the Emperor's deck from Azir, their most powerful card is always on the bottom, Ascended's Call. So if you just wait for that to happen, and then nab their Ascended's Call, which you'll get every time, and then for 10 mana, you can rally while summoning your level 3 Renekton and your level 3 Nasus, you will probably just win the game for free against them, which is really, really funny. Especially since Mono Shurima, that's all they're doing, right? All they're doing is just trying to get the Emperor's deck and trying to win off of these calls. The ability to use them against them for a free win that's so reliable, that's so easy, is just a really, really great counter option. Alright guys, that was the 11 tips using new Shurima cards and Empires of the Ascended cards, interesting interactions. I wanted to make a video like this actually as soon as I saw a lot of these Shurima cards, because there are a surprising amount compared to any other expansion. We've seen so many kind of just like new interactions that we haven't seen before. There's a lot of ways to use this new cards, and there's a lot of instances of just higher complexity in general, which I'm really enjoying. I love that there's just a lot more nuance behind the game now, and a lot more just like weird quirks and ways of using things that might not be immediately apparent at first. So hopefully you guys were able to take one or two things away from this video. I think there's a lot of interactions that I'd like to see people play different spots in the game a little bit differently, like I mentioned with stuff like Rock Hopper, like I mentioned with stuff like the attack orders. I think that there's a lot of, you know, just like minor optimization tweaks that people are missing out on, but also in this list there was a lot of like just like weird deck building options, ways of using stuff like concurrent timelines that I think that people haven't really tapped into. I don't expect a lot of that kind of thing to be as competitive, but still fun deck ideas for anyone interested and looking for new deck ideas. Alright guys, that's about all I got for this time, so I'll see you next time.